along for the ride.
Welcome to the Solar Coaster, the wild ride to the solar industry told by the people living it every day. I'm Anna Covert.
And I'm Alex Herrera.
When we picture the future of energy, we usually imagine something pristine. Endless rows of gleaming glass and silicon silently soaking up the sun, powering our cities without a single puff of smoke. It feels clean, it feels permanent. But beneath those shiny panels, hidden in the shadows, there is a relentless microscopic war going on every single second of the day. We are building the future, but we are building it out of Earth's oldest materials. And nature has a way of violently reclaiming what belongs to it. Today, we are talking about the silent saboteur of the renewable energy revolution. We are talking about rust.
It is a fascinating contradiction. We design these massive multi-million-dollar solar assets to last for 30 years of baking in the desert sun, freezing in winter storms, or getting battered by coastal salt winds. And while everyone focuses on the efficiency of the solar cells themselves, the actual survival of the entire power plant often comes down to the structural skeleton holding it all up. If that skeleton starts to decay, if corrosion takes hold, we are no longer just looking at an ugly brown stain on a metal pole. We are looking at skyrocketing maintenance costs, vulnerabilities to extreme weather, and in the worst case scenarios, massive electrical failures and fires.
That is the part that completely shatters the illusion for me. When most people think of rust, they think of an old bicycle left out in the rain or maybe a squeaky gate. It is an annoyance. But in a utility-scale solar farm, rust is not just a cosmetic issue. It is a fundamental threat to the physical and electrical integrity of the system. Let us start with the physical side. How much of a structural threat are we really talking about? Does a little bit of rust mean the whole thing is going to collapse in a windstorm?
Not immediately, no. The engineers who design these systems aren't naive. They know these metal structures will be exposed to the elements, so they build in a safety margin. They use steel that is thicker than the absolute minimum required to hold the expected weight and withstand the wind. So when surface rust first appears, the steel isn't instantly dysfunctional. It has that buffer. But the problem is that corrosion doesn't happen evenly. It is an opportunistic predator. It concentrates at the most vulnerable points, the interfaces. We are talking about bolted connections, weld seams, and the cut edges of the metal. These are the places where moisture gets trapped, where dirt and debris accumulate, and where the microscopic movement of the structure slowly grinds away protective coatings.
So it attacks the joints. It is almost like a kind of mechanical arthritis. The bones might still be strong, but if the joints are deteriorating, the whole body becomes fragile. And I imagine the fasteners, the bolts themselves, are right on the front lines of this battle.
Absolutely. Fasteners are a massive pain point in solar maintenance. Imagine a bolt that has completely seized up with rust. What should have been a routine 5-minute adjustment during a maintenance check suddenly turns into a labor-intensive nightmare. Technicians have to literally cut the bolts off and replace them, but it goes deeper than just stuck bolts. And when rust degrades a joint, it changes the physical tolerances. It alters the friction between the metal surfaces. So now when the wind blows and the structure sways, that joint moves a little more than it was designed to. That dynamic cyclical loading accelerates the wear and tear, creating a vicious cycle of degradation.
That covers the structural side, which is terrifying enough when you consider a massive storm rolling through a degraded solar farm. But you mentioned something earlier that I think will surprise a lot of people. You mentioned fire. How does a rusted piece of metal holding up a solar panel lead to a fire hazard?
This is where corrosion crosses the line from a mechanical headache to a severe safety crisis. In a solar array, the metal racking system isn't just a physical shelf for the panels, it is often an active part of the electrical safety system. Specifically, it provides grounding continuity. If something goes wrong, say a fault current jumps from a module frame, that electricity needs a safe, uninterrupted metal-to-metal pathway to travel through the racking system and down into the grounding conductors in the earth. It is an emergency escape route for dangerous electricity.
And rust acts as a roadblock on that escape route.
Precisely. Rust is not a good conductor of electricity. When corrosion builds up at those critical metal-to-metal connections, it interrupts the grounding pathway. Suddenly, your emergency escape route is blocked. This makes it incredibly difficult for the system's sensors to detect a fault. But it gets worse at the actual electrical terminals, lugs, and connectors. When corrosion infiltrates those areas, it increases electrical resistance. And in the world of electricity, resistance equals heat.
So you have high voltage electricity trying to push through a degraded, rusted connection, generating massive amounts of heat. It is basically turning that connection into a toaster element.
Exactly. The corrosion physically separates the conductive surfaces, the resistance spikes, the heat builds up, and eventually this combination can lead to arc faults. An arc fault is basically miniature lightning jumping across a gap, and it is incredibly hot. That is how a rusty bolt can ultimately ignite a fire that burns down a section of a solar farm.
It is a profound reminder of how interconnected these systems are. A mechanical failure becomes an electrical failure, which becomes a catastrophic thermal event. It makes you wonder how this happens in the first place. If we know these massive investments are going to sit outside for 30 years, why are they rusting prematurely? What are the underlying causes?
It usually comes down to three main culprits. The first is a fundamental mismatch between the protective design and the actual environment. The second is damage that happens out in the field during construction. And the third is poor component selection that actually accelerates the chemistry of corrosion. Let us break down the first one. Most utility scale solar structures rely on something called hot dip galvanizing to protect the steel. They coat the steel in a layer of zinc.
Zinc. I have always found the use of zinc fascinating because it is essentially deployed as a martyr. It is a sacrificial layer, right?
That is exactly what it is. Through a process called galvanic corrosion, the zinc willingly corrodes first. It literally sacrifices itself to the environment, protecting the structural steel underneath until the entire zinc layer is depleted. Because of this, the thickness of that zinc coating is the single most important variable in the lifespan of the structure. The required thickness is calculated based on how aggressive the environment is and how many years the plant needs to operate.
Which means if you calculate wrong, you are setting a ticking time bomb. If you take a protective specification that works perfectly well for a dry inland site in a mild climate, and you use that exact same specification for a solar farm right next to the ocean where there is constant salt spray, that sacrificial zinc is going to get eaten alive in a fraction of the time.
Exactly. There is absolutely no one size fits all solution for corrosion protection. Highly corrosive soils, coastal winds, heavy rainfall, all of these dictate how thick that armor needs to be. If the coating is thinner than it should be, or if the engineers simply underestimated the brutality of the site's environment, that zinc layer vanishes years ahead of schedule. And once the zinc is gone, the steel is completely defenseless.
That brings us to the human element, which is always the most unpredictable variable. Even if the engineers map the environment perfectly and the factory applies the perfect thickness of zinc, that steel still has to travel from a factory to a muddy field somewhere. It has to be unloaded, stacked, and assembled by human beings with heavy machinery.
And that is the second major culprit, field damage. You have forklifts moving massive bundles of steel. You have metal straps rubbing against the beams during transport. You have workers dropping things, stacking things improperly, or letting materials sit for months in wet, muddy staging areas. All of this physical handling scrapes and chips away that protective zinc coating. And then you have the actual assembly process. When a worker drives a bolt into a threaded connection, the sheer friction can strip the protective material right off the threads.
It is almost tragic. You have this highly engineered, mathematically precise protective layer, and it gets defeated by a forklift scraping against it on a Tuesday morning. I assume there is a protocol for fixing those scratches during construction?
There is. Workers are supposed to use cold galvanizing materials, basically a specialized zinc rich spray or paint, to touch up any exposed bare steel they find. But we are talking about tens of thousands of connections, miles of steel beams, and cut edges. Teams consistently underestimate just how tedious and comprehensive that touch up process needs to be. If they miss a spot or if they just don't bother, that exposed scratch becomes ground zero for corrosion. And to make matters worse, it is often incredibly hard to spot. Zinc galvanizing usually gives steel a hazy gray look, but sometimes, especially with thinner layers, it can look just as smooth and shiny as bare steel. Without very close inspection, you can't even tell where the armor is missing.
So you have a microscopic vulnerability hidden in a sea of metal. That leads perfectly into the third culprit you mentioned, component selection. I imagine the supply chain plays a huge role here. Developers are constantly trying to source parts from different places to keep costs down or hit deadlines. What happens when you start mixing and matching different brands and materials?
You get what the industry calls connector cross mating. It is a massive risk. You pair a component from manufacturer X with a component from manufacturer Y. They were never designed to fit together. Not only do you get awkward physical fits that leave gaps for moisture, but you often end up introducing dissimilar metals. When you press two different types of metal together in the presence of moisture, you create a tiny battery. You trigger galvanic corrosion. They literally start eating each other. And just like we discussed earlier, as that joint corrodes, electrical resistance spikes, heat builds up, and you are back to facing serious reliability and safety hazards.
It is the Frankenstein effect. You stitch together parts that don't belong together, and the resulting creation turns on you. So, looking at this massive multi layered problem from molecular chemistry to supply chain logistics to a guy with a wrench, how does the industry actually fight back? Because waiting for a bolt to rust and then trying to replace it seems like a losing battle.
It is a losing battle. Reactive repairs are almost always too late. The absolute best practice is a paradigm shift. Developers and owners need to stop treating corrosion as a warranty clause, something you argue about with the manufacturer after it breaks, and start treating it as a proactive life cycle program. It has to be managed as a measurable, controllable performance variable from day one.
And day one really means before the steel even leaves the factory, right?
Exactly. Prevention starts with writing specifications that are tied to the actual physical reality of the site. You have to analyze the soil, the drainage patterns, the wet dry cycles, and the coastal exposure, and demand a coating thickness that matches that reality. But writing the rule isn't enough. You have to enforce it early. One of the highest leverage things a developer can do is send inspectors to the galvanizing facility itself. Check the coating thickness before it even gets put on a truck. If you catch a problem at the factory, fixing it is relatively easy. If you wait until that steel is sitting in a field halfway across the world, your options shrink to expensive field repairs, anxious monitoring, or complete replacement.
It is the classic ounce of prevention versus a pound of cure. But let us say the plant is built, the steel is in the ground, the panels are generating power. What does that life cycle monitoring actually look like in practice? Because you can't have a team of scientists inspecting every single bolt every single day.
You start with practical visual walkdowns. Maintenance teams map out the site looking for clusters of corrosion. When they spot something, they don't just guess how bad it is, they measure it. They take out instruments to measure the remaining coating thickness at representative locations, especially at those high risk interfaces we talked about. And the recommendation is to do these spot checks on galvanizing thickness every 5 years. You take those measurements and compare them against the original engineering specifications to see if the zinc is depleting faster than the schedule predicted.
What happens if the numbers look wrong? What if the rust looks unusually aggressive or the thickness readings are all over the place?
That is when you escalate to metallurgical analysis. This is a much deeper diagnostic step. You take samples and send them to a lab to figure out exactly what the coating and the base steel are composed of and how the protection was originally applied. This is crucial because it helps owners distinguish between a superficial cosmetic rust stain that just looks bad and true material loss that is compromising the structure.
And what about the electrical side? How do you proactively stop the fire risks at those critical connections?
It requires strict discipline. You only specify outdoor rated listed hardware for all terminals, lugs, and bonding components. You absolutely forbid connector cross-mating, and during inspections, technicians must treat any sign of discoloration, any localized heating, or any slight loosening at a connection as an immediate red flag. It triggers an instant inspection, torque verification, and usually replacement of the part before it can arc and start a fire.
It is striking how much of this comes down to simple vigilance. We are deploying the most advanced energy technology in human history, but securing its future requires a profound respect for basic chemistry and the slow, grinding forces of nature. We build these monuments to sustainability, hoping they will outlast our reliance on fossil fuels. But if we ignore the quiet degradation happening right at the surface, we risk undermining the entire transition.
That is the ultimate irony of renewable infrastructure. We are harnessing the infinite power of the sun, but we are doing it with materials that belong to the earth. And the earth is constantly trying to break them back down into dirt. If we want these assets to survive for 30 years and actually deliver on their economic and environmental promises, we have to respect that reality. We have to plan for the decay, measure it, and fight it systematically.
it really frames the green energy transition in a different light. It is not a magical, frictionless leap into the future. It is a grueling, decades long arm wrestle with entropy. Every clean electron we generate is a victory not just over carbon, but over the relentless march of rust. It makes you wonder, as we scale these technologies to cover vast stretches of the globe, what other invisible battles we are signing up for, and whether our attention to detail can scale as fast as our ambition.
Hop on a solar coaster, come along for the ride.
This episode of The Solar Coaster is narrated using AI generated technology, representing Anna Covert and Alex Herrera. The material presented is aggregated from publicly available solar industry news sources. All commentary reflects reported industry developments and does not constitute personal opinions, investment advice, or endorsements by the hosts or
Solar
producers.
Coaster is proudly sponsored by Sun Energy Today, redefining what solar means for business and infrastructure. We engineer and deliver large-scale clean energy solutions, from megawatt solar farms to advanced graphene storage, designed for resilience, performance, and measurable return. Sun Energy Today, built to power what's next. Learn more at sunenergytoday.com.